Hi everybody, I'm Sophie and I'll be speaking about how IoT devices are used in interpersonal abuse. IoT devices are really popular these days. There was a study in 2019 that estimated that 69% of US households had at least one IoT device. They give us convenience, efficiency, a number of other benefits, but unfortunately IoT devices can also be misused. Recent news stories show that abusers are leveraging IoT devices to spy on and harass their intimate partners, family members, friends, neighbors, and others. We call this troubling trend IoT abuse. Researchers have begun to look into IoT abuse. For example, some have designed threat models that manufacturers can look at during design to prevent IoT abuse. Some have also looked at specific smart devices and tried to anticipate the ways they can be misused. But one thing that we're still missing is really a good understanding of the problem we're trying to solve. Beyond anecdotes in the news and snippets from interview studies and survey studies, we don't really understand all of the devices that can be involved in IoT abuse and the ways they can be misused. So in this work, we tried to broaden that understanding. We wanted to know which IoT devices can be involved in interpersonal abuse and how they can be misused, which properties of these devices enable abuse, and how we can think about this problem as more than just a sum of devices and strategies for abuse. To do this, we did a systematic survey of web content. We started with over 21,000 search queries that we generated from templates like spy on blank using blank. We also added automation to this process, so we submitted our queries to Google's query suggestion service until we had 25,000 queries. Then we sent all of these search queries to Google Search and collected a total of over 70,000 unique web pages from the search results. Obviously, not all of these were relevant, they never are. So we filtered the pages using manual heuristics and also a random forest classifier and ended up with around 26,000 filtered pages. And finally, we took a sample of 320 pages for further qualitative analysis. The pages we looked at included news articles about real-world IoT abuse, forum posts from survivors and abusers about their experiences with abuse, how-to pages telling potential abusers how they can use IoT devices to abuse others, and more. In these web pages, the targets of abuse were most often intimate partners, but they were also family members, including children, roommates, neighbors, and others. And finally, many of these web pages included real accounts of IoT abuse, either from the first person or the third person. But I want to emphasize that some of these also just talked about a potential for abuse. So for example, in the how-to articles, they discussed ways that abusers could misuse devices to abuse others, but they did not provide proof that those have definitely been used in practice. So in the rest of my talk, I'll be speaking about ways abusers have misused IoT devices, but also ways that they could be misused and ways that have been spoken about on the internet. Okay, so what kinds of IoT abuse did we see in our web pages? I want to emphasize that what I'm going to talk about is a simplified version of our results. Please see the paper for more details, including this cool paper, or table. So the main finding we got is that, first of all, many IoT devices can be used in abuse. Particularly shared use devices were the most common. So we saw home control devices like smart speakers, many kinds of smart appliances, security systems like motion sensors and cameras, and smart vehicles and vehicle accessories. We also saw that abusers can use personal use devices against others. This included tracking devices like AirTags, entertainment devices like AirPods and other Bluetooth headphones, as well as smart toys, and covert spy devices like hidden cameras that are designed to be hidden for surveillance. We saw also that abusers can use these devices in several ways for abuse. One category was spying. We saw that abusers can use these devices to perform audio surveillance, video surveillance, location tracking, and accessing private data. So for example, using a smart speaker to view someone's calendar. Beyond spying, abusers can also harass with these devices. First of all, we saw instances of abusers disrupting the home environment by flickering lights, changing the temperature, and also threatening physical safety. For example, changing the temperature can be very dangerous if someone turns the heat low in the winter, especially in Wisconsin, or if someone uses a smart lock to enter a home without permission. We also saw that abusers can manipulate private data in addition to looking at the private data. For example, they can make purchases on someone's smart speaker and add to additional financial abuse, which Rosie's going to talk about in a moment. And finally, this spying and harassment can all lead to a level of psychological control over a survivor, making them feel like their home and their personal belongings are not even safe from abuse. So I've given you a list of devices and ways that they can be misused, but it's kind of hard to think about addressing this problem when it's so disparate. So we came up with a framework which we call abuse vectors to simplify the problem into a set of 4 vectors. The vectors are on the right, and we visualize them as a flowchart, so I'm just going to take you through the flowchart. The first thing we ask is the device that's being misused covert? Is it hidden? If yes, that's the covert spying vector, when abusers hide devices in order to spy on their partners. If the device is not hidden, then we ask, is the abuser a non-owner of the device? By some definition of owner, really, should they have access to this device? If not, we call that the unauthorized access vector. This typically happens when abusers live with the person to begin with, and then leave the home, but retain access to the devices within the home. If the abuser is an owner of the device, and it's not hidden, then we ask, is a secondary functionality used? And we define a secondary functionality as some function of the device that we can remove, and it will still work as intended. So if a secondary functionality is used, we call that repurposing. And an example here is if someone lends their roommate their AirPods every day and uses the AirPods to track that person's location throughout the day. The location tracking feature isn't necessary for the headphones to work as headphones, so that's a secondary functionality. And finally, if the device is out in the open, it's not hidden, the abuser owns that device, and they are using the primary functionality of that device for abuse, we call that the intended use vector. And we call it that because in these instances, the intended benign usage of the device is very similar to an abusive use of that device, which makes it very hard to counteract. Now, one thing I really like about the vectors is that they give us some really tailored solutions based on the main issues with each vector. So for covert spying, the issue is devices are hidden. So we need to detect hidden devices better. We need to prevent the sale of covert spy devices on mainstream retailers, which Rose is going to talk about later. We need to make devices that are not supposed to be hidden announce themselves so they are harder to hide. For unauthorized access, the problem is access control, right? Someone is using a device maliciously, and they really should not have access to that device. And often it's because they've retained access. So we need to make it easier for survivors to revoke an abuser's access to devices when needed. And we also need to make sure they are aware that they need to revoke access, because sometimes survivors don't realize that that is their responsibility. When access revocation is not an option, we also need to provide legal options so that survivors can compel an abuser to give up access. For repurposing, we need to identify dangerous secondary functionalities and either remove them or find a balance between the risk and the reward of that functionality. And finally, for intended use, we can update access control protocols so that survivors can more easily maintain access to their devices. We can improve the transparency of IoT devices with better logs and notifications so that abusive behavior is lifted up and survivors are made aware of it. And along with that, we need to increase attestability so that those logs and notifications can be used to prove that abuse is happening, either just to a survivor themselves to validate their concerns or in the court of law. I want to leave you with some ways I hope that you all can leverage the framework. For researchers, I hope we can work towards addressing each of these vectors in the ways I've just described. And I also hope that this encourages the community to focus on holistic solutions to IoT abuse and tech abuse as a whole. Instead of trying to address a specific device and a specific way it can be misused, let's think about addressing whole vectors at once. For manufacturers, I think they can consider vectors during design. So think about how devices could enable each vector. Can your device be hidden? If so, it could enable the covert spying vector. And how can you fix that? And finally, for policymakers, I think they can promote protective legislation with the encouragement of the vectors. So for example, the abuse vectors show that unauthorized access is an issue. And there are laws, like one in New York State, which can compel an abuser to give up that access when necessary. But those laws are not really widely used, and they're not available in many jurisdictions. So we should promote legislation like that. And finally, policymakers can require action from vendors to promote, I guess not promote, but to share how their devices could be used in abuse on the package and what steps they have taken to prevent that abuse from happening. That's it for me. Thank you so much.